There we go. He's on campus already? I know. Why didn't he tell us? Why is Bill not in my comp squad?
They're all really good.
Anyway. Okay, well that would be one. Yeah, I posted about it. You should have seen. Oh, today? But like, where is he in general?
I can't remember.
I need to see him. Also, that also means that he has a very tenuous grasp of how time works.
The scheduling works out because I have
It does sound like him, though, so I have no reason to not believe one day. Okay, I'm ready to begin. Okay.
I will give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. We'll see how it goes. Oh, does anybody want a copy of the handout, by the way? Just a handout of the slides. I have 2 copies of the bigger print ones and 30 copies of the smaller print ones. Oh, I guess thank you. Yeah, they're over there.
Okay. So thanks for coming, everybody, on this beautiful day today. I'm Mike Flynn. I'm the chairman of the linguistics department. This public defense of ideas in the candidate's comprehensive essay is an important part of the linguistics major. Here at Carleton, we are fortunate to have wonderful students. Students who are bright, energetic, sincere, polite, and enthusiastic. Students who care about each other and about the world outside of Carleton. And who are willing to make an effort to make both Carleton and the world it is a part of better. The linguistics department strives to encourage and assist our students in a number of ways. In particular, our comms process is designed to support the wider goals of the department and the college. We invite students to work on a sophisticated project, one that requires hard-won specialized knowledge. It is an important opportunity to master a complicated topic, have something original to say about it, and articulate those ideas in a way that is not only compelling, but graceful in both writing and speech. This is what we think of Carleton education is all about, and it is what we in the linguistics department try to help students achieve. We want every linguistics student to face intellectual challenges and manage them well. If you can do this, we think you can do anything. This is not such an easy task. It begins in the fall with the choice of topic, which itself is a challenge, and the formulation of a tentative thesis. Most of the writing occurs in the winter term, supervised by a number of the faculty. The process culminates in a public defense such as the one you will see here today. As with most important things, there are specific rules for these events which must be adhered to. The candidate speaks for no more than 30 minutes. And then the first reader may ask questions, and in this case it's Professor Osrey. And then the second reader may ask questions, and in this case it's Professor Fortin. Then the floor is open to everyone, and by everyone we mean everyone on earth. The idea is that arguments in the essay should be defensible against challenges from all reputable observers anywhere. So if Noam Chomsky, for example, has learned about this COMPS project, he is welcome to submit questions to me, which I will then pose to the candidate at the appropriate time. As I said, the candidate's ideas have to be defensible against all reputable observers. The talk ends no more than 60 minutes from when it begins. And there'll be a reception, I think.
There's a reception.
There will be a reception immediately following, to which you are all invited. So today's defense is by Zach Richmond. Zach comes to us from New Lenox, Illinois. He's been a very active member of the Carleton community. He was a co-director of Chelsea 1117. I'm not completely sure what Chelsea 1117
I don't think anybody who's involved with it is completely sure of what it is either.
So, it's not so bad. He's a student manager at the telecom office. He's worked at KRLX and been a part of MP2. He's been a part of Pro-Choice Minnesota at Carleton and in mock trial. And most important, of course, he was on the 2014 Carleton Linguistics in Kyoto program. We have representatives back there. He's been focusing on speech pathology, but today it's syntax, hardball syntax. And the title of his talk is Appealing to a Higher Projection, Determining the Possibility of a Unified Analysis of Relative Clauses in Algonquian Languages.
Well, first of all, thanks for such a great introduction, Mike. Indeed, we have come here to do, as you say, hardball syntax. So I guess let's just begin right out of the gate then. As Mike mentioned, the title of my talk is Appealing to a Higher Projection, Determining the Possibility of a Unified Analysis of Relative Clauses in Algonquian Languages. And that's kind of a mouthful. So we'll be examining several syntactic analyses of relative clauses in 3 different Algonquian languages and trying to see if there's one analysis that can be applied to all of them. So we'll first introduce the issue a little bit more in depth before discussing 2 papers, the first of which is Johansson 2013's analysis of Blackfoot, and the second of which is Lockyer and Matthew's 2013 analysis of Ojibwe. Afterwards, we will apply both analyses to a 3rd Algonquian language, in this case Passamaquoddy, followed by applying Lockyer and Matthew's analysis specifically to Blackfoot, and we will, just so we can cross-apply it there. And then finally, we will have a few conclusions. So, 2 syntactic analyses of Algonquian relative clauses, which throughout the presentation will be referred to as RCs, appeared in the same issue of the Canadian Journal of Linguistics, Lockyer and Matthew's paper on Ojibwe and Johansson's on Blackfoot. And these analyses are particularly interesting since they apply to heavily polysynthetic languages. Polysynthetic languages mean that a particular language has a lot of morphemes, which are small discrete units of language, attached together to form larger constructions. So these languages obviously vary significantly from English, and it's very interesting to see sort of where the syntactic differences lie. And while neither paper's primary focus is arguing for a particular syntactic structure, both propose very unique syntactic analyses for relative clauses in their respective languages that differ pretty significantly. So because of this divergence in between the analyses, the sort of natural question then may be to ask, well, if we have these analyses that can be sort of applied to potentially similar languages, is one analysis applicable to both of them and possibly to other ones then as a result? So we will determine this possibility by first reviewing the 2 papers in question that I mentioned earlier, and then applying their respective analyses to another Algonquian language, which is, as I mentioned, Passamaquoddy. So first we will start off with Johansson 2013's analysis of Blackfoot. She primarily argues that Blackfoot relative clauses are participles and not nominalizations against France 2009. Participles are these hybrid verbal nominal constructions based on Baker 2011's work on Saka. I won't get into it too much here, but essentially what Baker proposes is that participles in Saka, which is this Turkic language, are, as he puts it, less verbal than, or more verbal than actual nouns, but less verbal than gerunds, so ing words, and definitely less verbal than full CP constructions. He gives actual percentages for these, but we're not going to go into that at all. She demonstrates this by arguing that Blackfoot relative clauses cannot be possessed or modified by adjectives, features that we would expect of a nominalization. So I'll get into both of those pretty quickly. So for possession, deverbal nouns can be possessed in Blackfoot, but not verbs. So we will compare 1 and 2. 1 is a relative clause, 2 is a nominal form. We can contrast the 2 meanings here with my one who is cooking versus my cook. The key difference here is the woman morpheme in number 2, which definitely makes it more nominal and thus able to be possessed. However, the first one with the relative clause, it's ungrammatical for it to be, or have the possession morphology attached to it. So the second one is modification, and this is a little bit trickier concept. So in Blackfoot does not have a specific adjectival class as a word, but instead it has a series of what Johansen describes as attributive roots that get interpreted as adverbs when modifying a verbal stem and as adjectives when modifying a nominal stem. And so we have this example up here, the one that caused Katie, Sherlon, and I a lot of grief for a little bit. The original translation by Johansen was definitely a little bit different than this, and it made it a bit more complicated to understand. But so we have, since this is our first Blackfoot relative clause that we're taking a look at, if you'll notice omixi over on the left side, that would be considered to be the nominal component of the participle, and then the verbal stem omaka yokaitsi is the verbal component of that, and then the adjective nogosawa off to the right. So in this case, the meaning of this sentence translates roughly to those big sleepers who are my children. And from this, based on the morphology, we can get the adverbial meaning of it, which would be they are habitual sleepers. But we can't get the adjectival meaning of it, which would be those sleepers are physically large. And so because the interpretation is adverbial and not adjectival, Johansen argues that the relative clause is not completely nominal then, like we would expect for regular nominalizations. So she then goes on to argue that Blackfoot relative clauses are similar to other clausal types based on certain features that they possess, which other clauses in Blackfoot do. And we're going, there's three features that I listed up here. They're domains for obviation, they are recursive, and they allow for long distance extraction. However, for the sake of time, we're only going to be talking about long distance extraction. So if you all can see this here, this is a very, very lengthy data point, so I will do my best to explain this concisely. So Johansen argues that long distance extraction of a head from an embedded relative clause is possible. 4b is the construction which contains the long distance extraction in this case. 4a does not. So in 4b we have this construction anixi ikoan ixi, which is extracted and moves to the beginning of the relative clause, and then the traces in 4b are represented with blank spaces. So what the best way of looking at this again is probably by looking at the difference in the translated meanings. The one for 4b is Johansen's original translation. John said that those girls who I saw Manikapi kissing came in. Even then, Johansen points out that that's not necessarily the most entirely accurate one because of this verbalized demonstrative, which I will see if I can point this out to you. Yes, this thing right here, as you can see by this key morpheme, dan.verbalized, which means that it's a demonstrative that's verbalized, basically. So because of that, the actual meaning of the construction is closer to, John said that those girls, they are the ones who I saw Manikapi kissing came in, which definitely makes it a bit more harder to process as an English speaker, but it sort of gives us a sense of what exactly is being extracted in that particular case. So, however, they are dissimilar from other clausal types in a few ways. The key difference, or the two key differences being that Blackfoot relative clauses possess nominal, not verbal agreement morphology, and that they exhibit a rigid word order. So again, the nominal agreement is fairly self-explanatory. We can see the difference in nominal agreement on the relative clause. That's you can see on the far right of it, which is the animate plural morpheme, which is the nominal agreement that we would look for, as opposed to verbal agreement on other clauses, which in this case is the awa, which is that third plural pronoun morpheme. That's over on the right side. And then the other key difference is that they exhibit a much more rigid word order than other clausal types in Blackfoot. So this is again demonstrated by this perhaps odd sort of contrast in 7a and b. In 7a we have those, you'll notice that the translations actually aren't different in between the two of them. However, the meaning is actually different. So we can't get the meaning those men that are sleeping from that construction, and the reason why is because normally in Blackfoot nominal arguments, or normally Blackfoot nominal arguments can appear before or after a verbal complex or just be dropped. However, in a relative clause, they must begin with a demonstrative if it is present. So the demonstrative would be omixi over on the right side, and in order for us to get the meaning those men are sleeping, that would have to be over on the left side of it. So instead we get this perhaps somewhat semantically odd meaning, they are sleeping those instead. So because of this, the general takeaway from all of this is that Blackfoot relative clauses sort of occupy this intermediate space. They're sort of clauses. They're sort of like other clauses. They're sort of not like other clauses. They're sort of verbs. They're sort of nouns. They're just in between everything, more or less. So this is Johansson's structural proposal, then again based on Baker 2011. The interesting thing about this is that if you'll notice up here, it doesn't start off with a CP. She argues that Blackfoot relative clauses aren't full CP constructions, and instead the CP gets replaced with two projections. HP, which is called highest projection, contains the nominal component, which if you'll remember from point 3 earlier, that would be like the omixi component of the sentence. And then participle phrase contains the verbal component, which would be omaka yo kaisi. And in this case, arguments, here demonstrative head nouns, move up to the specifier of HP, which is not listed in this particular diagram, and then where H agrees with the features of the head noun. So that would be the animate plural morphology that I mentioned earlier. So the other interesting thing to note about this, for those of you who have a passing familiarity with linguistics, is that there is the TP construction, which we would usually expect to appear after participle phrase, is instead replaced with this inflectional phrase instead, and the reason why is because the head that we would expect to be T is actually I, and it encodes person, not tense, in Blackfoot. So this is generally just what the tree would look like for the omixi, omaki, okaixi. Again, we can see the nominal component moving up to the specifier of HP, and the verbal component sort of resting in participle phrase. This is, it's a bit difficult to sort of reconcile this, just because we have the verbal morphology, or the adjectival morphology, omak, which I glossed it as over here, the sort of adjectival root, as well as the aspect marker a. You'll notice that I put omak in the specifier of participle phrase, and a just sort of surfaces on top of the verbal stem. So it could go in a separate specifier as well. However, structurally, the tree remains a pretty good way for accounting for the data in Blackfoot. So next, we'll move on to Lockmuller-Matthew's analysis. They also argue that Ojibwe relative clauses are participles. Their definition is a little bit different. They argue that they are verbal forms that fill a nominal role. And they argue this because of the participle morpheme I, which is attached to the verb stem. So they saved us a lot of time by doing that, instead of going through possession modification and all that. However, they also argue that Ojibwe relative clauses are full CP constructions, unlike Johansson, and that they are WH constructions that involve full A-bar movement of an operator, in this case, a WH operator, similar to what would be in a question. So like who, for example. So there's kind of a lot of more difficult theoretical concepts to explain for this. So the first of these is WH agreement. Lockmuller-Matthew argue that WH agreement exists in Ojibwe, which is the primary basis for their argument that relative clauses are full CP constructions. It exists in other Algonquian languages, but not Blackfoot, as far as we can tell. They argue that phonological change is obligatory both in WH questions and relative clauses, as seen in the contrast below between ki wabim an and ga wabam anti. You'll notice the contrast, especially between gi and ga. Gi contains the just past morpheme, and ga contains WH dot past. So that's where those WH features come in. So how does this work then? So Lockmuller-Matthew proposed that WH agreement occurs by a feature inheritance first proposed by Chomsky in 2008. In the conjunct order, which is a verbal order that we'll explain later on, C introduces discourse features, which in this case would be WH features. A WH element then raises to the specifier of TP and agrees with the discourse features that have been transferred to T. And then the WH element travels upwards to the specifier of CP to satisfy EPP or some other similar principle. Lockmuller-Matthew's argue that the overt agreement occurs around T, though, since those features end up in T in phonological form, so when the sentence actually gets pronounced. So Ojibwe relative clauses are then like English relative clauses in that the operator of the WH pronoun inside the relative clause moves up to the specifier of the CP, where the head of the relative clause coindexes with the WH operator. That's sort of a lot of very dense information right there, but we'll have a visualization of what that looks like when we get to Lockmuller-Matthew's structural proposal. So next then we have to explain mirror theory. So for everybody who's in Shalon's morphology class, we've already heard quite a bit about this. But mirror theory was originally proposed by Baker in 1985. this entails the syntax sort of mirroring the morphology, so to speak. To put it in their words, the order of the morphemes generally mirrors the order of projections, and suffixes are gathered by movement up through the projections. So the long and short of this for Ojibwe is that as the verb travels upwards throughout the tree structure, it lands on the heads of different projections, whose heads contain the morphemes that attach to the verbal stem. These morphemes are then attached to the right of the verbal stem, and then eventually the verb lands on T. So what does that look like then? We can see it up here for this tree for the construction, 10 below, Gawabam Wa Dian. So I think I'm just going to kind of point out with very physically how this sort of works. So we have the verbal stem wab over here, and as it moves up, first it would attach itself to which is the transitive morpheme over there, and so it gets attached to the right. Then as it travels up to that attaches over to the right, and so on and so forth until it goes all the way up to T, where, as you'll notice, the prefix ga is already located as the WH features that surface around T, as Lockgill and Matthew argued. So this trace down here is actually where the WH operator originates, and we can see it traveling upwards to the specifier of TP, where those features then get inherited down to T, and then eventually upwards to the specifier of CP. So that's why we have that sort of plus WH feature kind of dangling around in the tree up there. So that's about it for Lockgill and Matthew's proposal in a nutshell. One other thing to just explain very briefly, conjunct order, what that means is that, so there are two different verbal orders in Ojibwe. Verbal orders are just different inflectional systems in which a verb can appear in. So independent order appears in matrix clauses, uses a specific set of agreement suffixes, and a person proclitic. Conjunct order doesn't have either of those. It has a different set of agreement suffixes instead. So you'll notice the contrast between 11 and 12. And the key difference here is that you'll notice the presence of the first G over on the beginning of 11. That is the person proclitic that we're referring to. You can see the second person feature on it. And that feature does not appear in the conjunct order in 12. So 11 is the independent order, 12 is the conjunct order. So next then we will ask ourselves, okay, so now that we have both of these analyses, is one applicable to a different language instead? So because of this divergence in analyses, I chose to apply both analyses to Passamaquoddy. Passamaquoddy is interesting in terms as far as its relative clauses go for a few reasons. Number one, there's very little writing about them, as it turns out. These data are from Bräunig 2001's dissertation, which was sort of just a very comprehensive grammar. So the actual research on it, though, is fairly minimal. And the other interesting thing is that they can be either internally or externally headed. 13a is the externally headed relative clause example, and 13b is the internally headed one. So the key thing to note here is this MP boundary, which is sort of interesting to note. That is what is going to prove to be perhaps a bit contentious for us in just a moment. But otherwise, just sort of take a general note of it. So we have the difference here between PL took a picture of the man who's going to sell him a car versus the car that Suzette bought for me that goes really fast. So the first thing that we're going to do then is apply Johansson's analyses to both of these relative clauses then. And as it turns out, this is sort of roughly what I imagine it looking like. The key problem here, though, is that we have this skid up heel, which is being glossed by Bräunig as an NP. So this is a little bit complicated, as I assume then that sort of exists kind of in the matrix clause under this scenario here, just because of the way that he has glossed it. So what it might have ended up actually being is that that NP could actually have gone as part of the HP, but since it's hard to tell that, instead we have this construction over here, where the participle phrase comes before the HP, and then there's also this intervening tense clinic that comes in between it. So applying Johansson's analysis to this would require some fairly fundamental changes to it if we wanted to get sort of the direct order that Bräunig glosses as inside of his relative clause analysis. So we have the verbal stem up there being as part of the head of participle phrase, the person phrase afterwards, tense clinic, and then this object-esque thing, car down there. However, what's interesting is that their analysis at least seems to be more structurally similar towards the internally headed relative clause. The key difference, though, here is, again, the morphological ordering is a little bit off, we could say, just because, and it was also a little bit difficult to tell for Johansson's analysis of Blackfoot as well. Excuse me. So because of the syntactic issues that arise with 13a and the morphological issues associated with this tree, I concluded that Johansson's analysis would require several changes to be applicable to Passamaquoddy. And with regards to the whole sort of NP situation anyway, we will see that actually applying the full CP construction sort of makes for at least a cleaner analysis for us on that front. So next we will turn to locular and matches analysis of this data. Again, relying on his gloss, I assume that it's sort of outside of this CP domain. Again, though, it's just, again, depending on the gloss that he uses. So because of the V-to-T movement existing inside of Passamaquoddy, which was proved by Campana in 1993, we know that there is some movement that's happening upwards to T, so we can say that as the verb travels upwards, up towards T, it attaches itself to the person morphology that was described earlier before landing on T, where the person proclitic attaches itself. And then we have the NP down there in the bottom with the object. So that's a much more cut and dry explanation for how that sort of works then by using mirror theory. So then we turn to the internally headed relative clause, which we get over here. I'm sorry for Trueform making this look slightly confusing, but we do have Suzette moving up towards the specifier of TP in this case, as well as the verbal form moving up to T eventually. Again, though, there is a bit of a problem for us here as well, since there is the aspect morpheme, which comes on the left side of the verb, which we would not expect based on the principles of mirror theory. So there are two options for this. It could either go inside a specifier, or it could be housed on the head of T in this case, which is what I chose to represent, but it could potentially be either or. So it's not entirely without its problems, but locular match-use analysis seems to be more applicable to the Passamaquoddy data than Johansson's analysis is. So from that, we sort of conclude that it's at least more applicable to Passamaquoddy, but how does it fare then when it's compared to the data that we saw originally from Blackfoot then? So we will answer that question then. So the next step then for approaching this from a unified analysis is seeing then if locular matches analysis can be the basis for a more full, fleshed out unified analysis. So again, remember that the key difference between Johansson and locular match-use proposals is the presence of the full CP construction in locular match-use. So that's why we don't have the HP and participle phrases complementing it at all inside this next construction. And again, we'll be coming back to this construction, omixi, omakmio kaixi no kosawa. So the tree that I sort of propose looks a bit like this, where we have this tree that sort of goes along with the morphology. Again, though, the problem becomes much more pronounced with mirror theory in this case, as more of the morphemes are over to the left side of the verb in this case than are on the right side of it. The only one that's on the right side is this person animacy feature, which appears over on the right side of the verb. So that's ixi over there. In case you are wondering what is sort of going on over here, this movement does not mean that the verb is traveling upwards to the specifier of IP. Again, that just means that the specifier of VP, which is over here, is just traveling upwards instead. So that's what's going on with that, just so you're not confused with V potentially moving up to specifier of IP, which would be a little weird. So since mirror theory is unable to account for this, since it's all over on the left side, it can only collect, and because it can only collect these person animacy features that are headed on I, and because we'd have to place both of these projections inside of the specifiers of IP, we conclude that locular matches analysis is unable to account for the differing morphology of Blackfoot, excuse me. So that's sort of the bulk of the major analysis there then. So our conclusions is that a unified analysis of relative clauses in Algonquian languages is simply not possible, as the features of relative clauses in the various languages are very diverse. Approaching the issue from the perspective of creating a unified analysis based on language family was a misguided approach in retrospect. Instead, it should have been focused more on the features of each language instead. However, we can use this sort of revelation about this approach to instead focus on creating more of a typology-based approach to Algonquian relative clauses then, that can also extend to other polysynthetic languages as well. So the typology looks something like this. We have a first type which involves the movement of a relative clause operator in a full CP construction based on molecular matches analysis. This would include languages like Ojibwe and Passamaquoddy. The operator would be a WH operator inside of Ojibwe, and it would likely be a null operator inside of Passamaquoddy. Again, I did not have enough data to know if there was no WH features that were appearing inside relative clauses in Passamaquoddy at all, but I think based on the data that I've seen, it's likely it's a null operator. And in type 2 then, there is no CP, and instead there is the highest projection and participle phrase projections that Johansson described in her analysis of Blackfoot. And this would include languages like Blackfoot and Saka. And so for that reason, we can see sort of where it's sort of crossing over in between language families then, and how it's applied more based on the features of each language. So for future research then, the typology I propose is very basic and should be significantly more fleshed out. And this could be, or you could go around this by extending the typology to other polysynthetic languages and determining what amendments need to be made. And then the other interesting question is this typology applicable to relative clauses in non-polysynthetic languages? For example, English. Could that situate in this typology at all? Or what about other non-polysynthetic languages? So whether they're fusional, agglutinative, etc. So that's about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councilman Sweet.
So I have big picture questions and just a couple like tiny picture questions. So,
All right, yes.
so big picture. So way back when we were trying to figure out the direction of this project, but you really wanted to see if you could find a unified analysis.
Mm-hmm.
What's the point of the unified analysis? Right? We saw different analyses for Ojibwe and Blackfoot because they're just different,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we've got what looks like WH agreement and something that's like English-esque in Ojibwe, and that does not happen in Blackfoot, and so we end up with a CP structure in the Ojibwe type languages and something else in the Blackfoot type languages. So what's the point of going down this path of trying to see if there is some way to have one analysis that's applicable across Algonquian languages?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for most linguists, there is this sort of like internal drive inside of you, because all languages are very, very different, that there has to be some sort of unified analysis for pretty much every sort of phenomenon that you can possibly account for running through it. I mean, that's why we have like universal grammar, for example. Supposedly that's what Chomsky proposed that can be applied to every single language ever, but not without its own flaws, as we've seen over the years, of course. So my drive for it was just sort of seeing these and seeing the way that they sort of worked in different languages. And so my general thought was, okay, so both of these analyses definitely work for their own respective languages, but my thought was, well, what if one of them could potentially be a better way of accounting for this data? And as it turned out, that really wasn't the case, just because, again, as you mentioned, just the features are so different, much more so than I thought when I first attempted to undertake the project. And so for that reason, I think it was definitely a worthwhile exercise to try and see if this unified analysis could exist, just to see, at the very least, if there was a better way for accounting for the sets of data that we've seen. But it was almost, I don't want to say it was a wash in the end, but it just didn't turn out the way that I thought it would, certainly.
So other big picture question, right, as we've been talking about in morphology, like when we put actual forms, the actual morphemes into the syntactic structure,
Yes.
like that adds an enormous amount of complexity to the structure and burdens the syntax. Right? The syntax is responsible for like, creating really, really complicated words. So
Yes.
has running through this exercise made you think differently about the place of morphology? Should some of this stuff be happening outside of the syntax?
That's a very good question. I think the sort of approach that I was taking with this project was that the majority, if not all of it, was sort of happening inside syntax as that was all going on. I think like one way we've sort of seen that is the movement of this WH operator in the Lockmuller-Matthew analysis up towards the specifier of CP throughout its various iterations. That sort of, to me, seems like a very like directly syntactic thing that occurs. So I've sort of been operating under that mind frame that it's occurring all inside of syntax then, for those reasons. But I think if there is anything to be said for it occurring outside of morphology, or outside of the syntax, it's a bit difficult to say since, because these are polysynthetic languages, we have a way to better account for these, where we have all these different projections that sort of introduce these features that come into the tree sort of directly. So, of course then, this is sort of just more based on looking at only polysynthetic languages. For languages such as English, if it applied in this case, I think it'd be a bit more difficult to tell where the boundaries lie between the syntax and the morphology inside relative clauses. And even potentially for something like Passamaquoddy with the null operator, for example.
And tiny picture technical question.
Yes.
Can we go back to the applying Johansson's analysis to the Passamaquoddy externally headed relative clause?
Yes, are we going to talk about this? Yes.
Do you not want to?
No, oh, I mean, since I've written my comms, I realized that this issue might have not been as complicated as I thought it was.
Oh, tell me what you're thinking then.
Just because, like, I think that maybe what potentially might have happened was that I might have misinterpreted that data point then, and that what could potentially happen is that there is some CP boundary that's occurring outside of the way that Breunig labels these. So that what might have happened is that we have bracket CP, bracket NP, and then everything that happens in that externally headed relative clause there.
Okay.
So if that's the case then that would mean that what's being housed inside of HP is skita pio. Which would, and then if we have that, then the participle phrase comes immediately afterwards, and then tense comes afterwards.
Okay, so HP is still is it high? Is what you just said?
Yes,
The
if that's
HP is higher.
yes, if that's the
Okay.
case, and there's some sort of boundary that exists between the VP inside of the matrix clause, or whatever projections are happening there, and then it goes directly into HP, then we would be able to account for that a lot better under Johansson's analysis, though.
Okay.
But the thing that I think about that then, though, is that again with the sort of boundaries surrounding the matrix clause and then the embedded relative clause, is that it's sort of hard to tell where that line is. Then, if we have VP going on to directly take, this nominal argument that comes after it. So that's sort of why I'm more leaning now towards locular matches analysis, is just because it feels like CP is a much better way of handling that. And if we operate under that similar analysis, what might also be happening then is that skita peel might actually be moving up inside of the CP construction then. And so that would be moving up towards, say, specifier TP, for example, from little VP.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, first, I want to publicly applaud you for your bravery in taking on this incredibly complex set of data in this topic. You're dealing with things like obviative directionals on top of everything else.
Thank you.
You've got a bunch of scary ingredients here, relative clauses, polysynthetic languages. So this is not for the faint of heart. You've done a very nice job. So I want to invite you to talk a little bit about polysynthesis, since you didn't have time to talk about it yet in your presentation.
Yeah.
And you start your comps by saying that relative clauses are perhaps one of the most contentious areas of syntax and numerous theories explaining how to best analyze them. We've talked about that. And then you go on to say these analyses are especially difficult for Algonquian languages, which are heavily polysynthetic. So what is a polysynthetic language?
So I think the best way of looking at this is returning back to this tree, which sort of represents everything about polysynthesis in like one convenient diagram for me. Because we have all these different morphemes here, and as you can tell, for those of you who are not very familiar with linguistic glossing, even I consider myself at least pretty familiar with it, but that glossing down there is ridiculously complicated to just sort of look at. Because we have so much going on here. Even then, we have like this weird thing. You may be wondering to yourself, what is this third person into less than, or greater than, third person apostrophe? And that means that there's an obviative third person morpheme happening there. And so for that, what polysynthesis then is that we have sort of the basic features that we would expect of other languages, like the verbal stem in this case, for example. But then there's a lot of other morphological information that is attaching itself to these stems to create very long and oftentimes very complicated to at least gloss. For native speakers, of course, this is probably a piece of cake. And these are obviously look very different from a language like English, which has very different morphology to it. So I think that's sort of like a very basic explanation for what polysynthesis is. Again, the basic features added on with a lot more advanced features then afterwards.
So for you, it's primarily about morphological complexity.
Yes, that's sort of like, especially I think that was more of the feature that I was looking at.
Okay.
Especially because a lot of my comps involved morphological ordering and how that complicates syntactic analyses.
And can I ask you to talk a little bit about this qualifier heavily? You say that Algonquian languages are heavily polysynthetic. So do you think of this as sort of a continuum?
No. I actually, hold on. Was that in my presentation or was that my actual comps?
That was in your actual comps.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would necessarily consider Algonquian languages to be more heavily polysynthetic than, say, a language like Saka, for example.
Okay.
I think what I was referring to when I was talking about that was just saying it's heavily dense with morphemes inside of it.
Okay.
I don't think I would consider them a continuum. So that's what I meant when I wrote that down.
Okay. Cool. And what is it about being morphologically complex or polysynthetic that makes relative clauses particularly opaque? Is this something that you think extends to other areas of the syntax, or something that's unique to relative clauses?
Yeah, it sort of makes analyses a little bit more complicated since at the very least you have to account for the polysynthesis that occurs inside of the relative clause itself. Again, not to harp on this point too much again, but especially with a construction like this, as we can see, you have to find a way to account for all these morphemes that are occurring in there and what feature or where these features are sort of ending up in. So in this case, it would be in various projection phrases. But on top of that, then you have to account for things like, okay, so if there's an operator that's occurring inside of this clause, and we already have this much space being taken up by all these other morphemes that are occurring in here, well, where does that go then? And so Blackfoot and Ojibwe answer that in this tree by having the WH operator starting off in the specifier VP and moving upwards, as I pointed out. So, and then eventually, again though, because of EPP or whatever principle is guiding its movement up towards the specifier of CP, then even that sort of affects the morphology too, since then in that case, well, if it's moving up towards the specifier of CP, then why is the WH feature surfacing on T then? Because of, and even then that's sort of like a directly polysynthetic thing, since in this case we have the WH and the past morphemes, or features, excuse me, being tied together into one morpheme, which is of course attached to the verb. So trying to account for all of that then is definitely what I think sort of the key way, or sort of the key feature of using, or for how to account for polysynthesis inside of a syntactic analysis of relative clauses.
Thank you. And that's actually a really nice segue into my next question, which is about the presence of this WH operator in Ojibwe and Passamaquoddy, but which you don't seem to have in Blackfoot.
Yes.
But we have it in English and related languages and lots of other languages, so as far as we know at the moment, Blackfoot seems to be a bit anomalous in this respect and not having, obviously having evidence for this WH operator.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And going back to Chomsky, 1977, people have been trying to understand the parallels that we see between relative clauses and questions by positing that they both have this WH operator type thing in common.
Mm-hmm.
And one diagnostic that people often use for a WH operator or for WH movement are island effects. So my question is, right, would you expect to see island effects of any sort in Blackfoot relative clauses? Or would you expect them to be completely unbounded? And you talked about data point 4b, which showed that there's long distance extraction.
Yes.
And presumably that is able to proceed successive cyclically, but maybe that's not
Yeah,
the case.
presumably.
Yeah. But what do you think? I mean, would you, if you could, for example, ask a Blackfoot speaker if they could say, I like the jelly that was peanut butter and only say much to test a coordinate structure constraint. What do you think they would say?
That's a very good question. I don't think I'm actually honestly sure what the overall effect of that would be. Again, since since also as I mentioned, Blackfoot relative clauses, although they allow for the sort of long distance extraction that occurs here too, they also have this sort of rigid word order to them as well. So I'm not sure what that would translate to for island effects then, if that would mean that we do have pretty sensitive island effects in that case, or if this sort of feature tends to rule out more, and instead we have a more unbounded type of scenario like the one that you mentioned.
And my last question. So in letters like Blackfoot, which is shown has no CP layer, so it has something called a highest projection.
Yes.
And you said in your presentation that these things are in sort of an intermediate space. They're sort of clauses, but they're sort of not clauses also. So does that mean that the term relative clause is misleading when we try to apply it to Blackfoot, or do we need to sort of reconstrue the term relative clause to account for these sorts of things?
Well, what I should have been more clear about in that case is that they're still definitely clauses. It's just relative clauses have some unique properties to them that don't occur in other Blackfoot clauses, and that they do share some properties that other Blackfoot clauses do have. So if I still think that they operate in that sort of intermediate space, but the intermediate space isn't between being a clause and not being a clause. It's being a relative clause and just being a clause, period.
So it's not required to be a clause. You don't have to have a CP layer.
I don't necessarily think that's the case in Blackfoot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to invoke Chair's privilege and ask the first question from the floor.
Mm-hmm.
So these languages all have a common parent, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, what do you think about this? If I understand your conclusion right, you've got these daughter languages, and it's not possible to construct a unified analysis of this. How is it possible that could be when they have a common parent? Can you talk about, this is sort of related to Shalanda's question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about, this is a big picture thing, but how could it happen that there can't be a unified analysis, especially when the languages have a common parent?
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting point to make, especially if, as like I say, it's more of a featural-based analysis instead that we have to make. And the interesting thing about that is, again, is that we can apply the same analysis both to Blackfoot and Saco, which come from two completely different languages, and thus presumably would have two completely different ancestors then as well. So in that case then, how I think sort of what happens is just sort of natural language change over time as like different people who speak these languages settle down into different regions, and the languages just sort of evolve naturally. So it might have been the case that this Proto-Algonquian ancestor had some sort of WH operator that existed in Blackfoot, and then over time it was just gradually omitted from the language. And so for that reason, and a similar thing that might have happened in Saco, for example. And so for that reason, it ends up being a coincidence that both of these languages, which come from very different families, end up having similar features in that regard. So I think that's likely what might have been the case then in that situation. Because obviously they do share like some very like basic features, like for example being polysynthetic languages, but they don't have others.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes, Joanna?
So I think it was data point 3, you said that Johansson had a different translation than you ended up with. And I was just wondering like how they differed and how you arrived at this translation in this class.
All right, let's talk about 3 then, yeah. At this point, because I've spent so much time like thinking about it, like around a month or so ago when I was finishing up my comms, like I feel like I should have the original translation memorized, but I completely erased it. Like I actually, in my comms paper, I make a note that says, so this is what Johansson's original translation was, and for this reason, we decided to just completely change it. So the translation that you see is actually mine and not Johansson's, despite the fact that Johansson knows more about Blackfoot than I do. So the reason why is because actually the original translation, though, what I do know is that the way it was translated into English, it actually was not a relative clause in English, which was the complicated part about it. So we were sort of puzzling for a while. Okay, so it appears to be a relative clause, though, since it shares other features of relative clauses that we've come to expect in Blackfoot, but the translation suggests that it is not. So that's a very interesting contrast to have. So it was something like, those big sleepers are my children, along those lines. So for that reason, we just came to the conclusion that, well, because of the way that the way that all three of these components sort of interact with each other, we assume that the translation of it is actually those big sleepers who are my children instead. Yeah.
Do you have any questions? We did not hear from Chomsky, but I'm quite certain that if he had had a chance to read this, he would have been extremely interested in it. He's, recently remarried, so maybe he's got other things to think about. But this was a really excellent, and like Katie was saying, a very brave paper, and you're to be congratulated for doing such a great job with it. So congratulations.
So thank all of you for coming out here, and thanks especially again to Mike, Katie, and Shalon. Katie and Shalon especially for reading over all of this and helping me get through some very confusing moments of when relative clauses just seem complicated. And thanks to Mike for especially encouraging me in the early stages of the project as well. And thank you for all supporting the results of that project. Let's eat. I was recording it for my parents.